The lobby clock ticked softly, almost drowned beneath the shuffle of papers, muted footsteps, and the low hum of conversations drifting across the wide glass hall of a corporate building that looked ordinary from the outside, but was actually the headquarters of one of the most powerful financial groups in the city. Behind the reception desk sat a young woman named Alina, her fingers poised over the keyboard, her smile ready for every visitor who approached. She wasn't the highest paid employee, nor the most important by title, but everyone who had passed through those doors more than once remembered her warmth. What they didn't know, what very few even noticed, was the quiet detail that made her unique. She had spent years learning sign language after growing up with a younger brother who couldn't hear. So when a stranger stepped into the lobby that morning, an older man with tired eyes and a notebook in his hand, Alina noticed instantly the way his gaze moved without sound, the way he tapped his fingers subtly, seeking recognition in a world that often ignored people like him. Without hesitation, without waiting for him to fumble through writing or gestures, she lifted her hands and signed a gentle greeting. "Good morning. Can I help you?" The man froze, stunned, then broke into a smile that spoke louder than any words could. The other employees passing through hardly paid attention. For Alina, it was natural kindness. For the man, it was the first time in weeks someone had spoken to him in his own language without him having to ask. And what Alina could not possibly have imagined in that moment was that this man wasn't just a visitor. He was testing something, silently observing, and the weight of her simple kindness was about to ripple through her life in ways she never thought possible. Because while she saw him as just another guest in need of help, the reality was that he was a millionaire, one with influence, connections, and an unusual habit of disguising himself to understand how people treated those who seemed ordinary or vulnerable. And here, in this lobby, on an ordinary morning, Alina's fate was being rewritten in silence. Before the day ended, her name would echo in rooms she had never been allowed to enter. Her story would travel beyond the glass walls of the building, and she would learn what it meant when life decided to reward the smallest acts of empathy. That's the power of moments we don't plan, the kind that arrive without warning and change everything. And before I take you further, if stories like this inspire you, about kindness, justice, and unexpected turns, make sure to subscribe to our channel Outstanding Stories, because you won't want to miss the lessons and emotions hidden in tales like this one. The man Alina greeted with her graceful movements of sign language stood there for a moment longer than most visitors ever did, almost as if he were savoring the unusual warmth of being truly seen. He carried himself like someone used to being overlooked in this form, but beneath his modest clothes and the quiet expression in his eyes was a presence that belonged to boardrooms, not waiting rooms. Still, Alina didn't notice any of that. She simply asked him, in clear hand motions, what business he had today, and when he signed back that he had come to drop off documents for an executive meeting, she nodded and guided him with the same calm respect she would have offered anyone else. What she didn't realize, and what the security guards leaning lazily by the elevators failed to register, was that this unassuming man was secretly observing the culture of the company he had invested in, the empire he had helped shape from the shadows. His name was Martin Hale, a millionaire who had built his fortune from industries that most young receptionists never even heard about. But Martin carried with him an unusual quirk. After years of being surrounded by people who only saw his money, his power, his carefully pressed suits, he began disguising himself in everyday clothes, blending into ordinary environments just to watch how people behaved when they thought no one important was watching. Some failed the test instantly. Dismissive waiters, impatient assistants, arrogant middle managers who couldn't hide their disdain for someone they assumed was beneath them. But every once in a while, he came across someone like Alina, someone who treated strangers with dignity, not because of who they might secretly be, but because it was who she was at her core. As Martin sat quietly in the lounge corner, pretending to fill out a form, he kept stealing glances at her. He noticed how she treated the elderly courier who shuffled in with heavy boxes, how she smiled at the nervous intern rehearsing lines before a presentation, how she even lowered her voice when she saw a man on the phone, trying not to disturb his conversation. Nothing she did was for show. Every gesture was uncalculated kindness. Meanwhile, in the upper floors of the building, executives buzzed with self-importance, unaware that their investor, the very man whose signature could alter their futures, was downstairs dressed as if he were just another overlooked visitor. And here's the detail that would later become the turning point. Martin hadn't told anyone he was coming. Not the CEO, not the board, not even his secretary. To everyone upstairs, he was away on a private retreat. That anonymity gave him the freedom to observe quietly. And as Alina once again lifted her hands to respond to a simple question from the deaf visitor, Martin felt a tug inside him he hadn't felt in years. It reminded him of his younger sister, long past, who had lived her life in silence, but who had once told him that the loudest language in the world is kindness. Watching Alina, he felt the truth of those words all over again. For the first time in months, he smiled sincerely, not the polite, businesslike grin he carried like armor, but a genuine expression of human gratitude. What Alina could not see from her desk was the storm beginning to brew upstairs. The CEO, an arrogant man named Douglas Vayner, was preparing for an important client, rehearsing numbers, polishing his speech. He was known for dismissing those he considered unworthy, for praising only those who could benefit him. And in a twist of irony, Douglas had once told the staff to treat nobodies quickly and coldly to keep the lobby moving, never wasting time on those who, in his words, don't matter to the company's image. But Alina had never listened to that directive. She couldn't. Something inside her always resisted the cruelty of corporate detachment. And because of that choice, because she had chosen compassion over compliance, her life was quietly intersecting with destiny. Martin sat there, scribbling notes he didn't need, waiting. The meeting upstairs would begin soon, and when it did, everything would change. Because the millionaire nobody recognized was about to reveal himself. And the woman who had treated him as more than just another face would discover what it truly meant when kindness came full circle. The room seemed to freeze for a heartbeat, though the receptionist, unaware of the man's true identity, continued to sign politely with a bright smile that carried no trace of awkwardness or hesitation. Other employees sitting nearby stole quick glances, some whispering under their breath, not out of mockery but from genuine surprise, because it was rare to see anyone in the office communicate so fluently in sign language, and rarer still to see it happen so naturally, as though it was the most ordinary thing in the world. The visitor, whom many would have recognized instantly if they only paid closer attention to his face, felt a warmth spread across his chest, a warmth that wasn't born out of his wealth or position, but from the pure, unassuming kindness of someone who didn't treat him differently. For years, despite being a powerful millionaire with an empire under his belt, he had carried a silent burden, one that no amount of money could heal. The feeling of being on the outside, overlooked in conversations, pitted in interactions, and often underestimated because of his deafness. Yet here was this young woman who had no clue who he was, treating him not as an inconvenience or an afterthought, but as a respected guest, using her hands and expressions to make him feel welcomed and seen. He signed back slowly, hesitant at first, then gradually with more confidence, their conversation flowing in a way that felt strangely liberating, almost as if the walls he had built around himself were cracking under the simple weight of her sincerity. Meanwhile, people began realizing who he was, whispers growing louder, and the receptionist colleagues grew restless, but she kept her focus entirely on him, laughing gently at his signed jokes, nodding attentively as he explained his reason for the visit, never once letting on that she saw him as anything other than a person worthy of her full attention. And in that unassuming exchange, without the glitz of boardrooms or the intimidation of wealth, a connection was made that carried far deeper meaning than any business contract could ever achieve. The silence that hung over the lobby was heavy but not unpleasant. It was the kind of silence that carried awe, as more and more staff began to recognize the distinguished man who stood there speaking through his hands with their receptionist, unaware of the sudden shift in the air around him. Phones rang and were answered absent-mindedly. Footsteps slowed, and a few visitors even paused to watch, as though they had stumbled upon a scene from a story that would be told for years to come. The receptionist, however, remained blissfully unaware of the growing audience and the hushed murmurs. Her focus was fixed entirely on the visitor, her hands moving with practiced grace, her expressions warm and attentive as she asked about his day, why he had come, and whether he needed assistance navigating the building. The man responded, slower than her, but with equal intention, and with every exchange his initial guardedness seemed to melt away. To him, every interaction in public had always carried two layers: the polite surface where people smiled but stumbled awkwardly, and the underlying truth where he could see their pity, their impatience, or their discomfort. This time, for the first time in so long, it felt different. He was not being spoken to as if he were fragile. He was not being coddled or dismissed. He was being greeted, truly greeted, with dignity. And as this realization settled within him, an old memory resurfaced, unbidden yet powerful. Being a young boy, watching people's lips move while he struggled to catch the meaning, feeling small and invisible. That boy had grown into a man who conquered industries, who amassed wealth that newspapers wrote about, who could walk into any office and have executives scrambling to impress him. Yet deep inside, the ache of that boy never fully disappeared. Now, standing across from a woman who treated him simply as a person rather than a spectacle, he felt that ache soften, as if her kindness was rewriting something in his history. Around them, tension rose because the moment carried a weight none could ignore, an unspoken understanding that something extraordinary was unfolding in an otherwise ordinary day. And though the millionaire noticed the shifting atmosphere, he chose to remain in this simple interaction, savoring it as if it were more precious than all the contracts stacked in his briefcase. The air seemed to hum as the realization rippled through the building. Words spread like wildfire, whispered from desk to desk, that the quiet man the receptionist was so casually conversing with wasn't just any visitor. He was the reclusive millionaire who owned half the companies whose logos glowed across the city skyline. A man who had transformed industries, built empires, and whose decisions influenced the livelihoods of thousands. Yet, here he stood, shoulders at ease, smiling in a way that was rarely captured by tabloids, responding to a receptionist's hands as if she were the most important person in the room. She had no idea, and that was precisely what made her kindness shine brighter. Where others would have tried to impress, she simply connected. Where others might have fumbled in awkwardness or rushed to dismiss him, she slowed down, gave him her presence, and honored his dignity. And as she continued guiding him, introducing herself in sign language and asking if he needed help with forms, the millionaire felt something stir within him that boardrooms and luxury could never provide. Respect freely given, not earned by wealth or demanded by status, but granted simply because one human being cared enough to see another. Slowly, he lifted his hand and signed a thank you, his eyes gleaming with something almost like relief, almost like gratitude too long buried. The receptionist, still unaware of who he was, signed back, "You're welcome," with a bright smile, and the room, now filled with executives and staff frozen in stunned silence, watched as their most powerful guest lingered a little longer, savoring the rare comfort of being seen for who he was, not what he had. Then, as if to cement the moment into legend, the millionaire turned to the gathering crowd, his hand gesturing toward the receptionist with an unmistakable pride. In a deep voice that cut through the lobby, he spoke aloud, his words heavy with meaning. "This woman treated me with more respect than many of you ever have." Gasps followed, but his face softened as he looked back at her, his voice lowering almost tenderly. "And that is something money cannot buy." That sentence etched itself into every soul present, a lesson none would forget. For in that instant, the power dynamics of the building inverted, not through contracts, not through wealth, but through a simple act of humanity. The millionaire left moments later, his entourage scrambling after him. But before he walked out, he leaned close to the receptionist and signed something she would never forget. "You reminded me I'm still human. Thank you." And as the doors closed behind him, silence reigned once more, broken only by the sound of the receptionist's unknowing chuckle as she returned to her desk, never realizing that her ordinary kindness had just changed the course of countless lives around her, and that the story of her greeting would be told long after the ink of business deals had faded.